This chapter will cover the endocrine system and very basic concepts of the endocrine system. Just keep in mind that all systems, body systems, work together. So they are all interrelated to each other. So in every other chapter, cardiovascular physiology, renal physiology, respiratory physiology, endocrine glands and hormones come into play. So this chapter will just give you an overview, but when you learn about the hormones with respect to a particular body system, it makes a lot more sense. So this chapter will cover the very basics of endocrine system. We look at the basic endocrine glands, and endocrine system works along with the nervous system to regulate the functions and maintain homeostasis of various body systems. But the response of endocrine system is much slower compared to the nervous system. Because if you remember, the nervous system can elicit a response within a matter of milliseconds, but endocrine system can take couple hours or even couple days to act or respond to a stimulus. Some endocrine glands we will be focusing on is the pituitary gland, which is the first endocrine gland we'll be focusing on. We'll be talking a lot about pituitary hormones, thyroid gland, which is another major gland in the body, adrenal gland, and the pancreas that secrete insulin. So we'll focus on these glands. However, keep in mind that there are other organs in the body that secrete hormones. Okay, they are not true endocrine glands, but these are organs that contain endocrine tissue that secrete certain hormones. And some of those organs include heart and thymus. Thymus we'll talk about a lot when we talk about the immune system. And then you have the kidneys that also secrete certain enzymes. Stomach secretes hormones, and then you have skin and the reproductive system as well. So the endocrine glands is what the chapter will focus on, but we also have something known as exocrine glands. Now, the major difference between endocrine and exocrine glands is that endocrine glands secrete chemical signals known as hormones directly into the bloodstream, whereas exocrine glands secrete chemicals or products into tube-like ducts. For example, the sweat glands, sudoriferous glands, the mucus glands, and the digestive glands, several digestive glands, and the salivary glands, saliva. All of these are secreted into a duct or a tube in the structure, which open up into the target organ. For example, the sweat glands secrete sweat into little ducts that open up into, say, the armpit or the groin or any area that you sweat in. Whereas endocrine glands secrete hormones. Okay, so endocrine glands secrete hormones, and these hormones are secreted into the bloodstream, and there are different mechanisms by which they are taken up by the target cell. So this picture gives us an overview of different endocrine glands in the body. The first one over here is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is the gland that secretes melatonin. Melatonin is the sleep activating hormone. So when you don't get sleepy, you can actually get melatonin pills over the counter, and you can just have a couple 5 milligrams of melatonin and fall asleep. But this is the same hormone as a tablet that induces sleep. We won't focus too much on melatonin. Then the other major gland is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, that's right over here. So hypothalamus, you might get, this might just throw you off because this is a part of the brain. But keep in mind, everything in the body is interrelated. So hypothalamus is basically the link between the endocrine and the nervous system. The hypothalamus is responsible for maintaining homeostasis, or the state of internal balance in the body. So the job of the hypothalamus is to produce, releasing, and inhibiting hormones. You might want to keep this terminology in mind. So hypothalamus produces releasing hormones that trigger the release of other hormones. Hypothalamus also produces inhibiting hormones that inhibit or stop the production of other hormones throughout the body. The next gland over here is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is a gland that sits in the sella turcica. Sella turcica is the region in the brain, the skull, where the gland sits. And you might have seen this bone marking or region while studying the skeletal system. So pituitary gland is also known as the master endocrine gland because the pituitary gland secretes hormones that affect so many other endocrine glands of the body, but it's a pea-sized gland located at the base of the brain. And then we have the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is something that we'll be focusing on in a little more detail later, but just keep in mind anything to do with the metabolism of the body. Thyroid gland would be related to it, okay? Because thyroid gland controls the basal metabolic rate of the cells in the body. And then we have thymus. Thymus is of a lot of importance when we talk of the lymphatic system. Now, thymus, interestingly, undergoes atrophy during childhood and it produces thymosin, but we won't be focusing on this in this chapter. Then we have adrenal glands. Adrenal glands produce a lot of epinephrine, norepinephrine that are responsible for fight and flight response. Then we have the pancreas that are responsible for secreting insulin that controls blood glucose and glucagon. Now, if you have not written all this down, it's okay because we'll be studying all of this in a lot more detail later in this chapter. Then we have the parathyroid gland is located right by the thyroid gland. So the parathyroid gland is located on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. So this is the thyroid gland and this is the parathyroid gland. So really tiny glands, and they play a very important role in calcium homeostasis in the body. And then we have the gonads, ovary in females and testes in males. Testes in males produce androgens, mainly testosterone, which are responsible for a lot of male sexual characteristics, and ovaries are responsible for a lot of different hormones like estrogen, progesterones, inhibin, which are responsible also for a lot of female characteristics in the body. The nervous system and the endocrine system are two major systems for communication in the body to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is important. If not, your body is going to shut down. Okay, so the endocrine and nervous system work hand in hand, but they also have some major differences. Okay, so let's start looking at the differences in the two. First and foremost, nervous system responds immediately within seconds, right? So nervous system responds immediately. So they're always fast acting. And endocrine system can either take seconds, or they can take minutes, or they can take hours. They can take a really long time, or they can act immediately. Now, the other difference is the type of tissue. Now, if you remember from histology, we looked at epithelial tissue, and endocrine system is mainly made up of glandular epithelium. A lot of times this epithelium is cuboidal epithelium. So if you remember glands and tissues, the glandular tissue, they're mainly made up of cuboidal epithelium. And then nervous system is obviously made up of nervous tissue. And the main mode of communication in endocrine system is known as hormone. Hormones are specialized chemicals that can travel in the bloodstream or in the lymph to communicate in the body. Whereas nervous system use chemicals known as neurotransmitters. They use neurotransmitters. So the signals can be chemical or electrical. Okay. Now, the other important difference is the specificity of the response. Okay, that means what type of cells are affected by the endocrine system and nervous system. Now, for the endocrine system, the target cells have receptors for a particular hormone. Now, the nervous system have receptors on a postsynaptic cell. The postsynaptic cell basically receives the electric signal. Okay. Now, the stimulus or the change in external environment can be internal or an external stimulus. But in endocrine system, the stimulus is internal. So how does the hormone travel? Okay, the gland, let me change the color. The gland secrete hormones into the interstitial fluid. So what is interstitial fluid? Now think about it. If you don't remember, you studied this in histology, but keep in mind interstitial fluid is the fluid that surrounds the body cells. Okay, so fluid surrounding body cells is known as interstitial fluid. From the interstitial fluid, they diffuse into the bloodstream, and from the bloodstream, they act upon target cells that contain a specific receptor. Okay, so these are some terms that are new to you, so make sure you're familiar with these terms. Target cell is obviously the cell that the hormone targets. Now, receptors are usually proteins on the surface of the cell that respond to a hormone or an external stimuli. Okay, so a hormone receptor will respond to a particular hormone. So now you should basically understand what hormones are. You should know at least the basic definition of a hormone. A hormone is usually a long-distance chemical that travels in the blood or the lymph. However, there are some short distance chemicals known as autocrine and paracrines. Now, autocrines are the chemical secretions that affect the secreting cell itself. We'll look at it in just a second. Okay, but let's look at paracrine first. Paracrine cells secretions are secretions that act upon neighboring cells. For example, if you have a allergy towards pollen, the cells in the bronchial tree in your lungs secrete histamine. Okay, histamine that causes an allergic response acts upon or attaches to the smooth muscles around the bronchial tree in the lungs, so right around that region. So they attach to neighboring cells. Okay. All right, so here you see a paracrine receptor. This is a paracrine cell that secretes chemicals, but these chemicals attach to the receptors on the neighboring cells. So these type of receptors are known as paracrine receptors, and the cells that secrete the chemicals are known as paracrine cells. Now, if you look at autocrine secretions, the cells that secrete the substance are known as autocrine cells, and the receptor itself is known as an autocrine receptors. Now, autocrine secretion are the type of secretion that elicit a response on the same cell. So you can see that this is a cell. The same cell secretes a chemical, and the same cell has a receptor for the chemical it has secreted. Now, autocrine chemical signals are common in the immune system, like interleukin 1 or interleukins that cause inflammation have receptor on the same cell. So interleukins respond to the chemical signals from the same cells. So just know the very basic definition. I don't expect you to know the examples in these. So there are two main classes of hormone. The first one is amino acid based hormone, and then we have steroid based hormones. The first one, amino acid based hormones, are water soluble for the most part. Most amino acid based hormones are water soluble hormones. Some examples are thyroxine, that is secreted by the thyroid gland. Then you have adrenaline. Then you have melatonin secreted by the pineal gland. All of these are examples of amino acid based hormones. So the amino acid based hormones can be amines or peptides or proteins. And then you have steroid based hormones. One more thing about the amino acid based hormone is that they have a smaller half-life. A smaller half-life basically mean in general, not exactly, but they stay in the system for a lesser time. Okay, so they degrade quickly. Okay, now steroid hormones require a carrier protein. Why? Because these are not water soluble. Steroids are sterols, like the cholesterol, which is kind of fat, and oily substance don't dissolve in water, and most of your blood is made up of water, right? So that's basically why steroid hormones require a carrier protein, because they are not soluble in water. And they are synthesized from cholesterol, and most gonadal hormones and adrenocortical hormones in the adrenal glands are steroid-based hormone. Compared to amino acid-based hormones, steroid-based hormones have a larger half-life, and that is anywhere between 50 to 90 minutes. It depends on the type of hormone. So comparatively, you can see that amino acid based hormones have a smaller half-life. So these are just examples of peptide and protein based hormones. The first one over here is oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone that induces labor. So people who get labor, women who have induced labor, they are given an equivalent of oxytocin, and it is known as pitocin. Pitocin is used to induce labor because it's a synthetic derivative that resembles oxytocin. And oxytocin is also helpful in while giving birth to twins, because when women nurse the first baby, it induces more oxytocin, which helps speed up the delivery of the second baby. Okay, another example is human growth hormone. And then we have amines and amino acid based hormones with modified groups. A lot of times these amino acids usually miss a COOH group. Thyroxine is an exception that we'll talk about later, but a lot of times amines or amino acid based hormones do not have a COOH group. Now, aldosterone, testosterone, estradiol, all of these are steroid-based hormone, and that's why they are not water-soluble. They require a carrier protein. Carrier protein, as the name suggests, a protein that carries a hormone to its target cell. Hormones circulate in the bloodstream, either as free hormones or bound to a carrier. So steroid hormones are always carried using carrier proteins. The only exception in amino acid based hormones are the thyroid hormones. Now the thyroid hormone contains a benzene ring, and this benzene ring makes it water insoluble. That's why the thyroid hormones require a carrier protein to be carried in the bloodstream. Now, all protein-based hormones are broken down in the bloodstream. You may want to write this down. Protein-based hormones are broken down in the bloodstream itself, so they have a smaller half-life period, and the lipid-based hormones are broken down in the liver. Lipid or steroid-based hormones are broken down in the liver. Now, the concentration of circulating hormone reflects the rate of the release, meaning how fast the hormone gets released, or the speed of inactivation, meaning how fast the hormone gets removed from the body. There are two main mechanisms for how a hormone affects the target cell, depending on whether they are water-based or sterol-based. Now, the water-soluble hormones, they cannot enter the target cell, meaning the water-based hormones attach to a receptor on the surface of the cell. Okay, so they cannot enter the target. Let's just say this is the nucleus. Okay, so they contain a receptor, or they attach to a receptor on the surface of the target cell. So this is the target cell and this is the nucleus. Now, lipid-based hormone, on the other hand, can pass through the plasma membrane, because these are lipids, and plasma membrane is made up of phospholipids, right? So the lipid-based hormone basically enter the cell membrane, and they can attach to a receptor either on the nucleus or a receptor in the cytoplasm. Okay, so lipid-based hormone act on intracellular receptor to activate or inactivate a gene in a cell. Okay, so they can attach either to a receptor on the cytoplasm, or a receptor in the nucleus, depending on the type of hormone. So this picture shows just a lipid-based hormone. All lipid-based hormones and thyroxine, thyroid hormones, need a carrier. So this lipid-based hormone is carried through the bloodstream with the help of a carrier. Then when they reach the target cell, they pass through the phospholipid bilayer. And then they attach to a receptor inside the cell or on the nucleus, and they can turn on or turn off the gene in the nucleus. Okay, why the gene? Because the gene is responsible for coding for proteins or anything else that goes on in the body. That's why we are talking about the gene over here. So water soluble proteins, all of them, all amino acid based and protein based hormones except thyroid hormones, they cannot enter the cell. They dissolve in the bloodstream, and when they reach the target cell, they bind to a receptor on the cell membrane. Okay, right under the cell membrane receptor, there's another protein known as G protein. The G protein activates another chemical known as CAMP in here. Okay, and CAMP activation causes activation of another enzyme known as protein kinase. Now, protein kinase activation can activate certain proteins in the cell that change or alter cellular activity. So you see how water-soluble hormones don't directly affect the gene. In turn, the water-soluble hormones affect the G protein and CAMP protein that affect other proteins in the cell to activate or inactivate certain proteins. Now, in endocrine system, you don't have to pay too much attention to these terms, G protein and CAMP, but in pharmacology, when you study how drugs work, these terms, if they are familiar, these are familiar terms, it'll help you in the future. A target cell, however, must have a specific receptor to that particular hormone. Without a receptor for a hormone, the cell cannot respond. For example, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is usually found on specific cells of adrenal cortex only. Okay, so this is a particular area where this hormone receptor is found. On the other hand, thyroxine, which is secreted by thyroid gland, the receptors for thyroxine is present all over the body, because if you remember, thyroid gland controls the metabolic rate of the body, so it affects nearly all the cells in the body. So the receptors for thyroxine hormone will be found nearly in every cell of the body. The hormone activation of a target cell depends on three important factors. The first factor is the levels of hormone in the blood. Okay, if you have a lot of hormone in the blood, it is very likely that that hormone will find its target cell and interact with the receptor. So if the levels are really, really high, that's a good thing, because the hormone will not need to look for a needle in a haystack, right? So the levels of hormone is an important factor. The second is the amount of receptor on the target cell. Now this is also important, because if the cell only has one receptor, what are the odds of the hormone attaching to that receptor? Right? So it's important that the cell has enough receptors for the hormone. Okay. Now, the third important factor is the affinity of the hormone and the receptor, meaning how strongly can the hormone attach to the receptor. Okay, how much attracted it is to the receptor is important. Okay, now all of these factors influence how a cell responds to hormone. Now, depending on the condition, depending on all of these factors, the receptor on a target cell can be upregulated or downregulated. Now, these are new terms, so make sure you understand these properly. In upregulation, the target cell becomes more active to the hormone. And how does this happen? Okay, let's just see. If there's not enough hormone in the bloodstream, the target cell probably needs more receptors expressed on the surface so it can attach to as many hormones as possible, correct? So when there's not enough hormone in the bloodstream, the target cell receptors will be upregulated by the hormone. Okay, so the target cell will end up expressing a lot of receptors so it can bind to the hormones as efficiently as possible. Okay, let's just say there's a lot of hormone in the bloodstream. Okay, so you don't want to overactivate your body. You want to maintain homeostasis. So if there's too much hormone in the body, we don't need as many receptors. So the hormone will end up downregulating meaning allow the target cells to be less active. Okay, when the target cell is less active, the hormone will downregulate the number of receptors on the surface of the cell. So keep in mind, upregulation makes the target cell more active because upregulation causes the expression of a lot of receptors, and downregulation causes the reduction in the number of receptors on the target cell. Okay, because the bloodstream will probably have a lot of hormone, so we don't need as many receptors to make the process efficient. A good example of downregulation is in diabetes. Okay, when the levels of insulin is high, it downregulates the production of insulin receptors in the body. Okay, and when we don't have enough insulin, we need more receptors so our cells can convert glucose more efficiently. Now, receptor interaction differs. So there are three types of receptor interaction. First one is synergistic. So let's read this together. Hormones produce a greater effect when both are present. For example, estrogen and progesterone. Let's take the example of pregnancy. During pregnancy, estrogen is responsible for vascularization, so increasing the amount of blood supply. It helps in promoting development of milk ducts in the breast, and it supports the baby. Okay, and at the same time, progesterone thickens the uterine lining. So both of these hormones are present in greater effect when each of these are present during pregnancy. So one hormone leads to a greater effect in another hormone. Now the second one is permissive interaction. Permissive interaction is when first hormone is required for the second hormone to have effect. So one hormone basically cannot get activated without the presence of another hormone, in a sense. For example, prolactin and oxytocin. Prolactin is the hormone that is required for milk production, whereas oxytocin is the hormone that is required for milk let down, meaning release of milk. Oxytocin does not produce milk. It only helps in release of milk from the breast. Now the third effect is antagonistic effect. This is simple because they're antagonistic each other. Hormones that have opposite effects are called antagonistic hormones. For example, glucagon and insulin. Glucagon helps in increasing blood glucose, whereas insulin helps in decreasing blood glucose. So hormones, like any other thing in the body, need to be disposed after they are used. Okay? So while in the body, the hormones degrade on their own with the help of degrading enzymes in the bloodstream. A lot of amino acid and protein based hormones get degraded in the bloodstream, but a lot of steroid based hormones are broken down in the liver, and after they're broken down in the bloodstream and the liver, they are later removed by the kidneys. Okay, now if you remember, we talked about half-life. Half-life is actually the time required for a hormone in the blood to decrease by half the amount. Okay, for example, let's just say you have I'm just rounding it up for ease of understanding, 2 nanograms per deciliter of thyroid hormone in your blood right now. So that's time 0 minutes. Okay, now after say 30 minutes, the amount gets reduced to 1 nanogram per deciliter. So the half-life period of thyroid hormone will be considered 30 minutes. So the time required for a hormone to decrease by half the amount is called half-life period. Now, why is this important? Half-life period is used for analyzing hormones in the laboratory. A very common example is the measurement of HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. Now, after miscarriage, so the human, let me start again. So if when a female is pregnant, the levels of HCG are really, really high. So this is what you test for on a pregnancy strip. After miscarriage, the levels of human chorionic gonadotropin fall in about 24 to 36 hours. So when somebody has a miscarriage, they check for HCG levels over a period of time to make sure the levels are going down. Okay, so that's an example of clinical use of half-life period in hormones. So all hormones levels are controlled by negative feedback system. If you don't remember what negative feedback is, you might want to pause the video and look up negative feedback mechanism in homeostasis. Now, as hormones levels increase in the body, negative feedback mechanism inhibits the secretion of a particular hormone if there are too much amounts of that hormone in the body. Now, as the blood levels, the hormone levels in the blood decrease, the glands kick in again and hormone gets secreted into the bloodstream. So this is all done to maintain homeostasis. So everything comes back to homeostasis in the end. Okay, so there are 3 types of interactions in the body that trigger endocrine response. The first one is humoral stimuli. Humor means humoral means anything to do with body fluids. So any change in blood levels of ions and nutrients causes the humoral response to kick in. And these are the simplest stimulus to endocrine gland. And a very simple example is a very simple example is regulation of calcium in the body. Now, calcium is mainly regulated by parathyroid hormone. So when there's not enough calcium in the body, okay, so when the calcium levels fall below normal, the parathyroid gland kicks in and the parathyroid hormone is secreted into the bloodstream. Okay. The second mechanism is neural stimuli. Neural stimuli, as the name suggests, involve nerve fiber stimulation, and nerve fiber stimulation is hormone response in response to stress. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, the response for fight or flight response, are involved in neural stimulation. Okay, so when you get frightened, the nerve system sends a signal to the adrenal medulla to release norepinephrine and epinephrine. And then you have hormone release in response to a hormone. So hormonal stimuli is the third response. And hormone release due to production of other hormone is called hormonal stimuli. Okay, so there are so many examples of hormonal stimuli that you'll understand when we look at pituitary glands.